Carol, we meet again.
Hey, it's not every day I get a political prisoner in my office.
For me, Carol, it's so strange because I've just seen a whole different America than I'm used to.
Well, you know, blacks have been used to oppression in America, and some of it has come from the Democratic Party. And it's been hard for me to accept because I was a Democrat for most of my life.
What made you change?
It was a number of different things. Some of it had to do with becoming a Christian, and the other part had to do with me learning more about the history of the Democratic Party and just watching how they use blacks for their agenda.
Carol, tell us a little bit about your life. You seem to be, your life has been a real success story.
It is, and I believe so much in the American dream. I was one of 12 children born in the rural South in Virginia. My father had a third-grade education. My mother was a high school dropout, and they divorced, and so I had a stepfather. All of us dropped out of school after the 8th grade. I married at 16, had my first child at 17, and you know, according to sociological theories, I should have been on welfare. I should not have had a future, but I ended up getting a high school equivalency, going to a community college, and earning the first of 5 degrees. I became a tenured professor at Princeton, and then I was hired by Vanderbilt during a time when I was going through a religious type of transition. But when Vanderbilt hired me, they thought they were getting this hotshot Princeton professor, and they ended up with someone that was a born-again Christian, and it's been interesting ever since.
History test. I want to name some prominent people who have been involved with America's racial history, and I'd like you to tell me simply if they were Republicans or if they were Democrats.
Okay.
Let's begin with the inventor of the positive good school of slavery, the idea that slavery was a good idea, Senator John C. Calhoun.
Democrat.
What about the guy who invented popular sovereignty, the idea that each territory could decide for itself if it wanted slavery, yes or no, Stephen Douglas?
Democrat.
What about the writer of the Dred Scott decision authorizing slavery and claiming that blacks have no rights, that a white man ought to respect, Roger Taney?
That sounds like a Democrat.
What about the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was also a Confederate general?
Democrat.
What about the great champions of segregation, the people who legislated separate but equal and the black codes throughout the South?
Democrat.
What about Bull Connor, the famous or infamous sheriff who resisted the civil rights movement?
Democrat.
What about the Arkansas governor, Orville Faubus, who shut the doors of the Arkansas schoolhouse until federal troops had to come in to allow black students to get in the door?
Democrat.
What about George Wallace, who said segregation now, segregation forever?
Democrat.
Terrific.
They're all Democrats.
Okay. Let's now talk about a few more figures in American history who resisted racial oppression. Abraham Lincoln.
Republican.
His Secretary of State, Seward.
Republican.
What about the 2 leading senators who championed the cause of abolitionism, Thaddeus Stevens and Sumner?
Well, they were Republicans.
What about Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave who became a champion of the abolitionist movement?
Republican.
What about Booker T. Washington, born a slave and champion of the idea of self-help?
Republican.
What about Eisenhower, who desegregated the armed forces and sent federal troops to allow blacks to enter the Arkansas schoolhouse?
Republican.
Carol, people often talk about the Civil War as purely a North-South divide, but isn't it true that the Civil War was equally a divide between the Republican and the Democratic Party, and even Northern Democrats like Douglas were protectors of slavery?
Yes, there were, and you can see this through the Civil Rights Acts that were passed in the 1800s, like in 1871 with the Ku Klux Klan bill. You saw the Republicans always pushing for civil rights for blacks, and the Democrats fighting it pretty much as a solid block. And so it wasn't just North-South, it was the Democratic Party itself that was the pro-slavery party.
What was the Democratic position on the Emancipation Proclamation?
They were opposed to it.
What was the Democratic position on granting blacks the right to vote?
They were absolutely opposed to it.
What about the idea of extending equal rights to blacks?
Opposition all the way, because they could not see any scenario where their former slaves would be political equals to white men.
Tell me about tell me about the efforts of the Republicans after the Civil War, and what happened to those efforts.
Well, you know, they set up the Freedmen's Bureau to help the newly freed slaves get on their feet because they had absolutely nothing coming out of slavery. And there was an effort to give blacks 40 acres and a mule. That legislation passed through the Republican-controlled Congress, but was vetoed by President Andrew Johnson. And it's really interesting to me because in some ways that was like affirmative action, right? It was like affirmative action, and you get the first expression of reverse discrimination because Johnson said it was not fair to the white men that were toiling every day to make a living for their families. And so the first expression of affirmative action for blacks just coming out of slavery was met by an argument for reverse discrimination.
That argument coming from the Democratic president.
Yes.
With the Republicans being the advocates of affirmative action, and you might even say of reparations.
The Republicans pushed for equality for blacks, and they really worked to integrate them into the society, get them on their feet, get them involved in the political system. And so it was really Republicans that were trying to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, you know, and the lofty ideals about all men being created equal. They seem to have taken that seriously, not the Democrats.
Now, even apart from equal rights, there was an orgy of violence directed against blacks, particularly in the South, led by the Ku Klux Klan. Tell me about the Ku Klux Klan Act and the effort to restrict that violence and what happened to that.
The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866 by Nathan Bedford Forrest, and he's from Tennessee. And it was actually founded at the Maxwell Hotel in Nashville, a hotel that burned down in 1961. And that Klan was like the terrorist arm of the Democratic Party. They sponsored the terrorism that not only took the lives of many of the newly freed slaves, many blacks, but also white Republicans.
What was their motive? What were they trying to prevent or accomplish?
They were trying to reestablish white supremacy in the South, put blacks back where they felt that they belonged, back in the fields, back in the houses. And I believe they genuinely believed that blacks were inferior, they were incapable of governing themselves, and that the white man had a right to suppress blacks and that they could use violence if that was necessary. And so they were using any means necessary to get blacks back into their place in the fields.
Would it be accurate to say that they were trying to create a kind of neo-slavery? In other words, they couldn't have slavery because the Civil War was over, but they were trying to exploit blacks now in a new way, sharecropping, but essentially an enforced subordination.
Once the military was removed from the South and they could go back to governing their own affairs, they immediately passed black codes and Jim Crow segregation, and they set up a system where if you were a black man or woman and you were deemed a vagrant because you didn't have a job, then you could be placed in jail. A judge could have you awarded to a white farmer, and you could be just totally enslaved again, and this time it was legal. Blacks had no rights during the era of the black codes and the Jim Crow racism. And the North, and you know, at some point, I guess even the Northern Republicans felt that there was nothing else they could do because they really tried hard during the Reconstruction era to protect blacks, but the system reverted back to what it had been before.
People think of the Ku Klux Klan as a ragtag bunch of racists, but the Klan had real power when we go to the early part of the 20th century, didn't they?
Yeah, today, I mean, they have other outlets. I mean, they don't have to run around in silly little suits. But back then, in its heyday, you know, it had over 4 million people, Americans, that were participating. They were judges, they were newspaper editors, they were governors, they were people in positions of power, and they were all, you know, aimed at reestablishing white supremacy, keeping blacks where they felt blacks belonged at the bottom, serving them.
Talk about the 1924 convention when the Klan showed up en masse at the Democratic National Convention.
You mean the Klan Day?
Yes.
Well, the Klan did what the Klan was known to do. I mean, they showed up for their convention. In many ways, the Democratic Convention was their convention. They knew it, they showed up, and they were welcomed.
The civil rights, the landmark piece of legislation that brought about equal rights in this country, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Many people think that was something that was spearheaded and done by Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat. But there's a more complicated reality, isn't there?
It is, because in 1957, it was President Eisenhower that pushed through the first Civil Rights Act. And he was a Republican, and you see all along the way the Democrats fighting against any type of civil rights for blacks. They fought against anti-lynching legislation, and they fought against any effort to give blacks the right to vote, the right to have equal public accommodations. And so Lyndon Johnson, when he got behind the Civil Rights Act, you know, he was sort of like, he was literally behind it, because the Republicans were the ones that really fought for it. And that part gets lost in the history too often.
Did a greater percentage of Republicans vote for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or was it a greater proportion of Democrats?
It was the Democrats that were fighting it, they were filibustering it. They fought tooth and nail to keep blacks from getting civil rights. And so it's so interesting today when they cast themselves as the party of civil rights, the party of blacks. They have an ugly history, and that history has been hidden for too long.
Chief Justice Earl Warren was the architect of the desegregation Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. What political party did he belong to?
By now, you know, he was a Republican, and he was appointed by Eisenhower. And yes, he was the architect for Brown versus Board of Education that desegregated public schools across the nation, or at least that's what it attempted to do.
Isn't it true that a larger proportion of Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than Democrats?
Yes, I mean, there was a pattern all along with larger percentages of Republicans supporting civil rights acts for blacks, and Democrats filibustering that legislation, fighting tooth and nail to kill it, and they were the ones that used the most profane. The Democrats were the ones that used the most profane language, derogatory language, when they talked about blacks. They didn't call them blacks, and they didn't call them Negroes. Enough said.
Who was Ida B. Wells?
Ida B. Wells was a journalist during the 1800s, and she worked for a Chicago newspaper. In fact, she worked for the only newspaper that consistently opposed slavery. I believe it was the Inter-Ocean paper. But she was a champion of civil rights.
Tell me about The Birth of a Nation, the screening of the film called The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith.
The Birth of a Nation was the first film that was screened in the White House. And President Woodrow Wilson, his family, they viewed that film, and it was really derogatory towards blacks. It presented black men as wanting nothing better to do than rape white women as their pastime. And Wilson, you know, gave the movie exposure, and he also indicated, you know, that the movie was an accurate portrayal of black men or black people. And so it was unfortunate for our country that the first movie ever screened in the White House was a racist movie by a racist Democratic president.
Who was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan?
Nathan Bedford Forrest was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan.
Now, the Klan had a revival in the early part of the 20th century. Why was that?
Well, it was that movie, The Birth of a Nation, and the high-profile visibility it received once the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, allowed it to be screened in the White House.
Now, was the Klan just against blacks, or were they also against other groups?
The Ku Klux Klan was against blacks and other groups. They were a danger to Jews, they were a danger to Catholics, as well as white Republicans. Anyone that wasn't in favor of white supremacy, the Klan would have been a threat to them.
Would it be accurate to call the Ku Klux Klan America's domestic terrorist organization promoting the interests of the Democratic Party?
Yes, I think that would be accurate.
Would it be accurate to say that most of America's ugly racial history isn't simply the fault of America, but is actually the fault of the Democratic Party?
It's the Democratic Party in the sense that they were the ones that birthed the Ku Klux Klan. They were the ones that protected the Ku Klux Klan. They were the ones that protected the most virulent racist politicians throughout our history. And they were the ones that fought the Civil Rights Act. So yes, was the Democratic Party. And it's so sad today to see that this Democratic Party that was so tied to terrorism and was so tied to that dark history of our nation, how they are celebrated by many minorities, that many minorities see the Democratic Party as their only friend.
Has the Democratic Party ever, in any official way, apologized for its own disgraceful racial history?
No.
Is it fair to say that when Democrats blame America's racial crimes on America, they're actually talking about things that they did?
I'm afraid yes, it's true.
Carol, how is it that the Democrats, who have perpetuated this long history of racial intimidation and violence, have now somehow sanitized that history and come off looking as the good guys? How do they pull that off?
Well, the Democrats are very clever, and they have apologists, you know, and many of them, unfortunately, are in academia, and so they have a new narrative, and in that narrative, they might concede, yes, we were the bad guys, but then we saw the light, and so we made atonement for our sins, and we became the good guys. But if you look at what they did throughout the passages of the Civil Rights Act, if you look at what they're doing today, they're not friends of blacks. They're not friends of minorities. They're using them now the same way they did in the 1800s, and they've also enslaved them in a new way. They've enslaved them to programs. They've enslaved them to lies. They have blacks believing that their whole future, their whole fate is tied to the Democratic Party, when that's not true. Blacks would be so much better off if they were in both political parties and if 90% of them were not Democrats.
But is it fair to make an analogy between slavery and the present in that slavery was involuntary? Blacks were dragged in chains. Here you have a case where blacks may be dependent on the Democrats or dependent on the government, but seemingly with their own consent.
Well, I mean, I think that deception plays a huge role, because blacks have been given this narrative that the Republicans are their enemies, that Republicans are going to take away their voting rights, that Republicans are going to take away their civil rights, even though we know that Republicans were the ones that fought for them to have civil rights. And so I think that a lot of people just don't know the truth, and the Democrats can't afford for them to know the truth, because if they know the truth, then they'll get off the plantation, because in many ways they're still enslaved, they're still on the plantation, and I say they, but I mean we. I'm one of the ones that escaped from the Democratic Party, and I'm just hoping that more people will see the light, especially the younger people, and that they will come out of that darkness.